Great. Well, I guess it's 5 p.m. We'll kick off our private event today. Hello everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you, Nefali, for putting this event together and hosting our panel discussions. My name is Duke Lam, founder of USI Technology. Our event today will be including two sessions. The first half, Dr. Lee will be discussing current industry challenges with well interference and now proposed solutions, followed by a Q&A sessions. Please feel free to submit your questions during the presentation through the chat box below, and Dr. Lee will be happy to answer them for you. The second half will be an interactive panel discussion with USI partners. We have a great lineup of speakers who can help answer your question regarding our science-based forecasting methods for your infill wells. I'd like to say thank you to all the past and current USI clients who have made this event possible. A lot of them are here with us today. Again, this event is designed for you. It will be all about you and your infill well economics. So without further ado, let's just kick off our first sessions, and I will be introducing Dr. Lee today. So Dr. John Lee is a professor of petroleum engineering at Texas A&M. John holds a bachelor's, master's, and PhD degree in chemical engineering from the Georgia Institute of Technology. He served as an academic engineering fellow with the U.S. Security and Exchange Commissions in Washington during the period of 2007-2008. And he was a principal architect of the modernized SEC rule for his reporting oil and gas reserve. John is the author of 4 textbooks published by SPE and has received numerous awards from SPE, SPEE, and U.S. National Academy of Engineering. Dr. Lee joined USI Advisory Board in December 2019. It's truly an honor to have Dr. Lee here with us today. So with that, I will turn it over to him.
Okay, thank you very much, Duke. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining with us. I want to try to make good use of time to leave most of our time available for our panel discussion later. So I'm going to kind of rush things now and introduce the presentation. Nefeli, do I have control? I don't seem to.
You should have control.
Okay. Nothing's happening when I try to advance the slide.
There you go.
Okay, maybe it will now. What I'm going to talk about is how can we maximize infill well economics? And we need to start with this question: why are we concerned about interference in the first place? You know, which is a problem that seems to have arisen when we talk about infill drilling. Well, outside influences coming from investor-oriented articles suggest that the ultimate recovery that we have estimated in infill wells has been overstated because allegedly interference was ignored in our methodology for estimating ultimate recovery. Most notably, and I think probably most influentially, there was a series of articles in the Wall Street Journal in 2019 which reflected the fact that investors were really concerned about our overestimates. Also, during 2019, there was an influential study by Wood Mackenzie which basically came to the same conclusion: we're over-optimistic in our estimates. But these are outside opinions and don't necessarily reflect what we in the industry believe is going on. However, in the last few months and years, we now see that we have industry studies which have been published which indicate that in fact close well spacing for infill wells and the duration of production from primary wells before those infill wells are drilled, that can decrease EUR. And that's what people within the industry have concluded. To me, the most definitive study like this has been with by VSO in 2019. That study is not widely available, but for those who want to learn more, I can provide a link for you to this website. But actual field data indicated without any question that there's a lot of interference in the Bakken. There's a model study, a little bit older, done by Schlumberger, which studied root causes of interference. Now, this is done by models, not necessarily based directly on field data, but left little doubt that we have problems with infill drilling. And the longer we wait to drill the infill wells after the primary well begins to produce, the more interference we're going to have. Same conclusion was reached in a study by Equinor, which has also been published in the last couple of years. So the industry itself has said we have problems with interference. So given that there is really and truly a problem, how can we solve this problem of overestimating EUR for our infill wells? Well, I'd say the fundamental consideration is we really need to model interference properly. Some possible approaches to doing that people are using or have suggested include, first, what we might say is the gold standard, and that's rigorous reservoir simulation with a couple geomechanical models so that we have a good feel for where the fractures are going when we fracture the infill wells. That's maybe the most accurate approach, but it's also very time-consuming, expensive, requires extensive input data requirements to do it properly, not suitable for routine analysis. Another approach which some people have used is to use analytical solutions that are available in rate transient analysis software. The basic idea here is to history match early data, which is going to be mostly transient data, that is pre-interference, and from those data, maybe get estimates of permeability and fracture properties. And then given that reservoir description, then with the analytical models, put in different well spacing to see when and if we're going to have interference. The problem here is these analytical models are really simplified. They're basically built on single phase flow models, and that's not real life either. Probably the approach that most people use most of the time is to base well histories on what they find from empirical decline curve matching and put those together and construct type wells, kind of averaging the empirical decline curves. Problem with that is pretty serious. And this is going to model interference only if that interference was present in the production histories of those wells that were used to construct that type well. So there's a need for something that's simple, rapid, inexperienced, and that can properly take into account interference. And I'm going to suggest to you that that methodology is what we're going to focus on here today, which we call science-based forecasting, or SBF. Now, this slide illustrates the fundamental problem that we face. What we have shown here, this is a plot of cumulative production versus normalized time. That is elapsed time since the well in question began to produce. And we have here a production history for 50 months from a well that's been completed in the Delaware Basin. And we also have production histories from wells that were drilled later, a couple of years after the primary well. And we have two infill wells whose histories are shown here. And we can see pretty clearly that the primary well is significantly outperforming the two infill wells. To be quantitative about it, for infill well 1, which had produced for 18 months at the time that we did a study, it had produced 122,000 barrels, whereas at that same 18 months after production began for the primary well, it had produced 187 million barrels. That's a 42% difference. And an infill well 2 drill near infill well 1 at 17 months of history that was available after it began to produce, had produced 40% less oil than had the primary well at the same time. So the infill wells are definitely underperforming. Now, the location of these wells and the basis for our case study here, these wells are in the Wolfcamp A formation in the southern Delaware Basin. The wells in question are shown here outlined in red. The primary well is shown in dark green, and the 2 infill wells near that primary well are shown in lighter green. Here we blow up this area. Infill well 1 is located 1,500 feet from the primary well, and infill well 2, 700 feet to the east of infill well 1. These are the 3 wells we're going to be looking at. And we're going to be looking at them with SBF, so let's address the question, how does SBF work? Well, SBF provides a physics-based approach to forecasting. It has all the rigor of reservoir simulation, which I mentioned earlier was the gold standard, except as it has been applied traditionally in industry, it's very time consuming. But SBF provides that same rigorous approach, and as available, it makes use of observed reservoir completion, production, and pressure data. And if that's not complete, well, we just proceed without it. The reason why this is fast is what SBF does, it retrieves pre-run simulations as a basis to history match the production in the primary well. With SBF, there has been a catalog developed which has thousands of simulations, and as reservoir engineers describe the characteristics of their area, we can pretty quickly find some simulations that have been run in situations that appear to be quite similar to the one under consideration. So what SBF does, it selects candidate simulations from stored results with parameters in the range of these known parameters. And then on this basis, we can forecast what the production of the primary well is likely to be, and also assuming that the infill wells have characteristics which are somewhat similar to the primary wells, but with a range of uncertainty allowed, we can forecast the future production of the infill wells. Here's an example of what was done in this particular study. I showed you this earlier, but in a bit different form. What we show here is the actual production history of primary infill well 1 in this 3-well study that I've been describing. That's shown here with the green curve. All right. This was a blind test, and what we did, we found what appeared to be properties in this area, looking at the primary well and allowing for a range of uncertainty in the infill wells near the primary well, and found a history match, which is shown here in the dark black curve, and the cumulative production at the end of 18 months, as much history is available for the primary well, matched that within 2%. Now, the traditional method is to match data with type wells constructed from the decline curves available for wells in the area. There are about 44 wells in the area of these wells. And so a type curve was constructed using all 44 wells. Here's what that type curve estimated. It's a bit further off. It was cumulative at 18 months was off by about 11%. But then with a type well constructed only with wells that began to produce after the start of 2018, the fit is a bit better. Now, what's sacred about 2018? Completion practices had been variable in this area, but had pretty much settled down by 2018. So the belief was that this would be more representative. And it is closer to history. In fact, the cumulative at 18 months came within 3%. So on the basis of 18 months of history, you can't really tell much difference in what the type well predicted and what SBF predicted. But you can see on this graph already that there's really a difference in the trend after that. And I'm going to suggest to you that the reason for that is SBF takes into account possible interference, and the type wells just don't, because there's no interference in these earlier production histories. And that's going to cause quite a difference. I'll elaborate on that as we proceed. So we might ask, so why use SBF? What makes it different from the decline curve based type well approach? Well, with SBF, we can answer some important questions like, could we have planned the infill well spacing better? Now, let's acknowledge what's done is done. Those infill wells have been drilled. They have been completed. There's nothing we can do about that. But maybe in a similar situation, we can do it better by studying the situation. And so maybe we could have forecasted the infill well production more accurately had we used SBF for planning purposes. And we might have been able to improve the future infill wells that we drill, space them in a more in a better way, and complete them in a more realistic way. And with SBF, we have some additional analysis techniques that are available. We can do pre and post drill type well comparison, type wells constructed from SBF in this case. We can ask questions like, is there an optimal spacing for our project? SBF has the capability of analyzing well spacing, as I'll show you. How does an index that we call FDI impact infill production? This is basically an index which looks at overlap of drainage areas for adjacent wells. And SBF has the capability of analyzing interference between fractures. If a fracture for one well goes into the drainage area of another well, that's definitely going to cause interference, and we've wasted money on either well spacing or fracture design if this happens. And then finally, SBF can answer the question, can we time our infills better? Well, SBF can analyze the timing of infill drilling. We could look at what happens when the infill well is drilled and completed at about the same time as the primary well, or 6 months later, or a year later, or a year and a half later. And we know from many studies in the industry, the later the infill well is drilled, the more interference we're going to have, the poorer the recovery we're going to get from the infill well. And we can study this with SBF. Let's look quickly at a spacing sensitivity analysis. Now here's the actual situation that I showed you on the earlier slide. We have a primary well 1,500 feet away. We have infill well 1. 700 feet away from that, we have infill well 2. That's done. There's nothing we can do about it. But again, we can study how we could have done this better. So we ran several cases. I show 3 of these here for illustration, in which we placed infill well 1 at different distances from the primary and infill well 2. And focus particularly on case 3. The infill well 1 is located about halfway in between the other 2 wells. And that turns out to be the best case. Now, we also looked at the possibility of drilling a 3rd infill well about halfway in between infill well 1, where it's actually drilled, and the primary well with the thought that maybe this is going to improve recovery. And we'll look at the economics of that before we're done. It turns out this didn't turn out to be a good idea, and we shouldn't do it. But let's go on. This graph summarizes the results of the spacing study. And what we have plotted here is cumulative production for 18 months comparing these wells, but also with the black dots, this shows the estimated ultimate recovery for a 30-year well life. Case 3, with infill well 1 halfway in between the other 2 wells, turns out to be the optimum. This is the recovery from infill well 1. Now, of course, we have to look at recovery from all 3 wells in the project, but we can do this for each well like we did it here for well 1. And that spacing halfway in between is clearly better than other alternatives. And look at what happens to well 1 when that 3rd infill well is drilled. That really takes production away from infill well 1. And this is the case of poorest recovery for infill well 1. Of course, we accelerate production with the 3rd infill well, and we have to look at what that does in our economic study, but it doesn't turn out to be attractive, as I'll show you. And here are the economics. This is overall economics for the entire project. This is a busy slide. I give some data which you might glance at here on the left. I'm not going to read those numbers to you. But what this shows, we have a plot of NPV 10 for 3 of the cases that we looked at for the spacing study. The base case, this is as the wells were drilled. Case 3, where we show what likely would have happened had the infill well 1 been drilled halfway in between the primary well and the infill well 2, which is further away. This proves to be the best case. And the case where we drilled that 3rd infill well, not only was the EUR for that well, EUR for well, infill well 1 lowered, the overall project economics were poor. Now, part of the busyness of this slide is we also show the internal rate of return over here on this axis, but we have several dotted lines here, and these are at different oil prices. Now, these projects would be economic at $60 a barrel. That's the top curve. But at $43 a barrel, which was the price at the time that we actually did this study, the project really would lose money. It would have an internal rate of return of less than 10%, so the NPV would be negative. Still, the best case is the infill wells equally spaced, and the 3rd infill well is definitely a loser. And we can readily study things like this quickly with SBF. All right, turning to fracture interference studies, we can study this with this parameter called fracture driven interaction, or FDI. The concept here is really pretty simple. FDI, that's the rock volume in the areas common to both of 2 adjacent wells. If we have a fracture half length in one well, like extending to the west like so, and the other well extending to the east, we have a considerable amount of overlap, and we can quantify that amount of overlap by calculating the rock volume within the stimulated reservoir volume common to both those wells. And it turns out that that simple calculation that we can make once we use what we know about fracture lengths, either from fracture design that we plan or from what has been achieved that we determine from analyzing the data, that simple calculation correlates extremely well with the amount of interference. And so we did a study of the impact of FDI on production forecast, and we show the base case here with a modest amount of overlap with 394-foot fracture lengths in both infill well 1 and infill well 2. Now, 394 feet, that's what we think the fracture length is in infill well 1, but we looked at what would have happened with different fracture lengths in infill well 2, going from short with no overlap, FDI 0, to a major amount of overlap with a 650-foot fracture, and that gives us 35,000 plus acre feet of overlap. And so the fracture half length was varied in the study. FDI was increased systematically, and the recovery decreased as FDI increases. So FDI and the amount of fracture interference correlate extremely well. So you can sort of predict what the outcome is going to be by calculating FDI. And the green bars, these come from the detailed reservoir study for 18-month recovery and the 30-year EUR. And the bigger FDI, the more the interference. Now, this is only in one well, but again, you can study each well overall and look at overall project outcomes, very simply. So to summarize quickly what I've said, certainly spacing significantly turned out to impact recovery in infill well 1. The highest increase was in case 3. As you'll recall, that is the case where the infill well 1 was drilled about halfway in between the planned location of infill well 2 and the original primary well. So that was optimal, but it wouldn't have to turn out that way. And it turns out there's interference only with a fracture half length greater than about 550 feet. This case had the least amount of interference. In the case of drilling a third infill well, that decreased EUR, and neither the total production nor the economics showed this as a favorable option. And again, very importantly, this increased value of FDI, the bigger that is, the poorer the recovery. So in conclusion, I'd say that both decline curve analysis-based type wells and FBF, they can forecast future production accurately for primary wells, at least up to the time that interference occurs. Decline curve analysis and FBF require comparable effort, and it turns out the costs are comparable. But SBF provides more accurate forecasts for infill wells and primary wells after interference occurs. Decline curve analysis just can't predict future interference. All the decline curve can do is look at interference that might have occurred during the lives of those wells. So SBF, that provides a sound basis for improving spacing, timing of future infill drilling programs. All right, this concludes my presentation, and I'll be happy at this point to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Dr. Lee, for the presentation. Now we're going to begin the Q&A portion of this talk. If you would have any questions, please feel free to submit them through the Zoom chat box. You can submit them either to me or to everyone so we can all see them. But to start things off, I would like to ask Dr. Lee a question. And I wanted to know if you can delineate interference effects from depletion effects using SBF, and if you know how we would do that.
Yeah, I think that you can definitely distinguish between the effects of fracture interference using this FDI concept, but fleshing that out with simulation. And you can tell the difference between that and simple depletion, which will occur in cases where we don't have fractures that intersect each well's stimulated reservoir volume. We can clearly find what that stimulated reservoir volume is with SBF. And then if we have poor production and the fractures, don't overlap, that's a depletion effect. But if they do overlap, that's interference. And we can distinguish between the two with SBF.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for answering that question. We have a question from the audience from Chris Alonso. He asks, how does the influence of runaway clusters affect the FDI? We know that we are not treating each cluster the same.
Well, what, you know, if you know what the difference in the clusters N is, you can take this into account in simulation. Quite often we just don't know that. And what we're forced to do with virtually any approach is to just assume some sort of average outcome in each stage and assume that those outcomes are essentially the same. It really takes a lot of really detailed insight into outcomes in wells stage by stage to do anything better than that. In principle, with simulation, we can do that, but we just so often just don't have the data to be able to do it readily.
Thank you for answering that question. We have another question here that asks, what is the minimum amount of data that is required to obtain a reasonable calibration of the SBF simulation models? And I guess a way that we can ask this differently is, would you feel comfortable using SBF in a prospective area when we have little public production data?
Yeah, you know, the similar question might be asked about type wells. Now, we can construct pretty good type wells from decline curve analysis if we have a lot of well histories to work with, and we can find a good average, which may or may not be pretty good in a specific subpart of that area, and that proved to be okay here, at least for the limited history that we had. Same thing is true with SBF and simulation. You know, if we have production histories from a number of wells, we can get a good feel for what average outcomes are going to be even before we drill our primary well. You know, we have a good starting point that we can use with simulation, and if we actually have production history for a primary well, as our blind study showed, we can do a pretty good job of forecasting without any production history at all yet what's going to be the outcome in those infill wells. So, you know, it's not going to be perfect, and the less data we have, the less accurate the forecast we're going to have, but we can still make forecasts which are pretty good, and I hope that blind study that I talked about really illustrated that point.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for answering that question. We have a three-part question from Brad Robinson from Matador. He asks, the first part, is SBF designed only to match production history, or can it match a combination of production and a pressure buildup test?
Simulation can match the pressure buildup test, and separately, simulation can match the production data. Now, I'm not aware of an application that has been used to look at a production history, which includes some buildup data. There's no reason in principle why we couldn't look at that sort of history, but I'll just have to say I'm not aware of that having been done in practice. So I better qualify my answer just to say, in principle, it's possible. In practice, I just don't know that we've done that. That would require more time. And, you know, the secret to SBF is using pre-run simulations. So do we have simulations that have been run, which include both a production history and a build-up test? I think the answer is probably not. These could be generated, but I think in the catalog of histories that have been run, I doubt that there's anything like that available.
The follow-up to the question is, can we match three-phase flow? And if so, can we account for the amount of fracture fluid pumped during the treatment?
Well, simulation can certainly match three-phase flow. Do we make an attempt to model this fracture fluid cleanup, and what happens during the fracture treatment? Again, I'm not aware of that having been done. In principle, it's possible, but to use SBF efficiently, we need to have some pre-run simulations, which include looking at injection of the fracture fluid and then fracture fluid cleanup. I'm not aware that the catalog includes that kind of situation at this point. If operators were interested in studying that kind of problem in depth, there's no reason why that kind of situation couldn't be included in the catalog of available simulations.
Wonderful, thank you. Another question from the audience. How do you validate the pre-run simulations using SBF or used for SBF? I apologize.
Well, the simulations are based on history matches of actual wells, and they are, these simulations are known to match typical wells with these kinds of properties. So, they have been compared to actual well production histories. That's about the only kind of validation that you can ever have for any simulation that I'm aware of, to be able to say it matches history. Are those matches guaranteed to be unique? Well, no, but the more history you have, the more similar wells you have, the more confidence you have that I believe I have found a match for histories typical of this area. That's not absolutely perfect validation, but I think it goes a long way to validating the technique generally.
Great. Thank you very much for answering that question. We have another question from the audience. How does SBF handle the transition from lift type, say from ESP to rod pump? Do the models change decline factors?
With what really changes an artificial lift is the effective average flowing bottom hole pressure. And you can certainly model that in simulation. You can say, when we change artificial lift types, we lower the effective bottom hole pressure. And you can put that in your simulation. And that's another one of those cases where simulation and SBF has an advantage over decline curves. With decline curves, it's really hard to model a change in flowing bottom hole pressure, which is caused by a change in artificial lift. But with simulation, again, change the bottom hole pressure, proceed with the simulation, and that can be handled. This may take some special runs. They may or may not be in the catalog, but they can easily be done when that's seen to be a problem of general interest. And these runs with this step change in bottom hole pressure can be included as part of the inventory that's available in the catalog.
Great. Thank you very much. We have another question here that asks, are increases in EUR with increased well spacing indicating that the effective propped volumes and drainage area are larger than what we once thought, or that there are less frac hit effects?
I'd say that if we see the increased EURs in wells with wide well spacing, that could indicate that in those cases with wide well spacing, we are getting some drainage from beyond the SRV that we ordinarily associate with that well. And, and if that's what we see from history is actually occurring, then I think we can legitimately claim that SBF can allow us to identify those situations in which we're draining more area, we are increasing EUR with wider well spacing, and maybe that says that maybe we might even want to space the wells a little bit further apart than what we originally thought, based on what we thought the size of the stimulated reservoir volume would be. We can validate that thought with simulation.
Mm-hmm. Great. And we have one more question here, and it asks, or I guess it states, you mentioned SPF, the SPF method does history match. So would it be reasonable to assume that it will always have a more accurate result than the DCA type well?
Well, I think except in rare circumstances, there's pretty good assurance that SPF will come up with a more reliable forecast than decline curve analysis. Now, decline curves, after all, they are history matches also, but there are two big problems with decline curves which we can overcome with simulation. One problem is that with simulation, we can take into account future interference that hasn't occurred yet. But with decline curve analysis, you just can't do that. If interference hasn't occurred, it's not part of your decline history. You put the decline curves together to construct a type well. You just have no chance of seeing this future interference. And a second difference is with simulation, you can model multi-phase flow. And, in areas like the Delaware Basin, with that volatile oil that's there in parts of the basin, you're going to go through a bubble point. And when you go through a bubble point, the decline trend is going to change. And simulation will model that. Decline curves? No, unless you've gone through the bubble point and all the decline curves you had that you put together to construct your type well, you just don't see that effect of multi-phase flow. So for these reasons, I believe that SBF is likely to be, to come up with much more reliable production forecasts than type wells based on putting together histories from decline curves.
We have one last question from the audience. Do you believe we can increase EUR with improved completion practices like fewer perf holes and diversion, either mechanical or chemical, to help solve this problem?
I don't know. I would just have to look at individual well performance, and I just have to say, I don't know. I can't answer that question.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Lee, for your presentation and for answering the audience's questions. If the audience has any more questions, please feel free to contact us. Our contact will be at the end of this presentation, or you can send it through the chat and we will save these questions as they come in. This does conclude the presentation Q&A for today's event, and we will continue on to the panel event.